Let's start at the very beginning. A very good place to start.
Whoa. Okay, Julie Andrews, hold your horses. We don't need to start at the very beginning. So we'll skip things like the Big Bang and even the dawn of the dinosaurs. Even though dinosaurs are the best thing in the world, but that's totally cool. We'll start at around about 50,000 years ago, so we've skipped a few years before that. This was a time when the country of France was known as Gaul. In the 1st century BCE, the Roman Empire was conquering different lands in Europe. They conquered Gaul and the people there adopted the culture and the language of Rome. The French language is a derivative of Latin from which the Roman Empire spoke.
Bonjour, you cheese-eating surrender monkeys!
By 400 AD, the Franks began to move in. Now this was just one of many dramatic tribes that migrated from northern Europe into Gaul. This is where the country of France is today, and the name of France comes from the Franks. One of their most powerful rulers was Charlemagne, also known as Charles the Great. Now this dude was cocky, Mr. Cocky.
How'd you get to be so cocky, Mr. Cocky?
He was said to be 7 feet tall and able to jump on a horse fully armoured, chainmail and all. Not only that, but he had big feet, so big that he is the reason we have the measurement for the foot we use today. Now ladies and sexually confused men, you know what they say about men with big feet. A really big, throbbing credit card bill. Can you imagine how much stuff he would have to have custom made because of his huge feet? It would be very, very expensive. Now here's a little fun fact that you might not know about. The kings in the deck of cards represent a real person from history. The King of Spades is David from the David and Goliath story. Clubs is Alexander the Great. Diamonds is Julius Caesar. And Hearts is Charlemagne. Now Charlemagne expanded the Frankish Empire to rule a large portion of Europe. From there he conquered Bavaria, which is today a federal state of Germany, with its capital being Munich.
Ach du Lieber, das ist not einer Bubi!
He also took on a campaign in Spain to fight the Moor tribes who were invading, and some success there meant a portion of Spain became part of the Frankish Empire. Charlemagne was popular, and at the request of the Pope, he also conquered the northern parts of Italy and took over the land including the city of Rome. By this time, the Roman Empire had fallen and collapsed. On Christmas Day in Rome in 800, Pope Leo III surprisingly crowned Charlemagne Emperor of the Romans over the Holy Roman Empire. Now the Holy Roman Emperor was considered the protector of the Catholic Church. He also had the backing of the church and was considered the leader of the monarchs of Europe. Although this title didn't really have an official power, it gave Charlemagne much respect throughout Europe. He brought many reforms to the Franks, including a strong government, written laws, education, and even support for the arts. Charlemagne himself was illiterate, and he believed strongly in education and enabling his people to be able to read and write.
Me fail English? That's impossible.
By the mid-800s, the Frankish Empire is given to Charlemagne's sons after he passed away. But his sons couldn't agree on how the country should be run, so they split off from each other, divided the country of Gaul, and later created the regions that would become known as the kingdoms of France and Germany. In the years to follow, William I, usually known as William the Conqueror and sometimes William the Bastard,
Get in my belly!
was the descendant of Viking raiders and had been Duke of Normandy in France from 1060. But Mr. Greedy Pants wanted more, so he launched the conquest of England in 1066 and became the new King of England, uniting the French and English lands.
Fresh in your drink, Governor.
New rulers came in over time, but under Henry II, the lands owned by England and France became even larger, and the kings who followed Henry found the land they owned in France too large and too difficult to control. By 1337, the tension between France and England had built up so much that soon a war would break out, known as the 100-Year War. In between this 100-Year War, while England and France invaded each other, fighting off the opposition, Europe was struck by a plague known as the Black Death. The Black Death is believed to have arrived in Europe by sea in October 1347, when 12 trading ships docked at the Sicilian port of Messina in Italy after a long journey through the Black Sea. Many people gathered on the docks to greet the ships, but they were met with a horrifying surprise. Most of the sailors aboard the ships were dead, and those who were still alive were gravely ill. They were overcome with fever, unable to keep food down, and delirious from pain. Strangest of all, they were covered in mysterious black boils, the size of a modern-day apple, that oozed blood and pus, and gave their illness its name, the Black Death. The Sicilian authorities hastily ordered the fleet of death ships out of the harbour, but it was too late. The disease was believed to be brought over by flea-infested rats. These fleas contained a virus that would attack the human bloodstream. When a host rat would die, it would look for another host. This kind of sounds like a storyline from like an alien invasion movie or something. Over the next 5 years, the mysterious Black Death would kill more than 20 million people in Europe, almost 1/3 of the country's population. Later in life, the Black Death would be compared to the Ebola virus breakout. But with science more developed in the 21st century, extreme precautions were taken, reducing the spread of the deadly Ebola virus. So the 100-Year War just kept on going, round and round and round and circles. And when King Henry V became the King of England in 1413, he once again laid claim to the throne of France. He invaded France and won a decisive battle at Agincourt, where with only around 6,000 soldiers, he defeated a much larger French force of around 25,000. Eventually, the French gave in, and the French king named Henry as the heir to the French throne. However, many of the people in southern France did not accept English rule. By 1428, the English then began to invade into the southern parts of France. They began a siege of the city of Orleans. However, a young peasant girl by the name of Joan of Arc took leadership of the French army.
Bonjour, my name is Joan of Arc and I was born in 1412. I lived in a small town known as Jacques d'Arc in the French countryside. That's right, I grew up on a small farm with my father and mother. Yes, my father was a well-respected man who was on the board of the council in our small little village. I worked on my father's farm as best as I could, working every single day, until in 1425 I took a nap in the barn, and I had a vision. I had a vision from Archangel Michael, Saint Margaret and Saint Catherine came to me, telling me that I was going to lead the French to victory over the English as they were taking over our French land. I listened to these visions, but I needed to get to the king, so I tried my best. I petitioned in our small village in order for me to get permission to go and visit him. I managed to gain support and went and saw King Charles VII. I told him of my visions, so he sent me out on a mission. It was a relief program, which would happen out in Orleans. He then gave me an army, and we fought in many battles for the French independence. A little fun fact about me was that I was the creator of the bob haircut. That's right, I had long hair and needed to cut it off for the war. And so, the bob haircut was born. After our many victories, unfortunately I was captured in 1430 by the English, and then I was sent to trial in 1431.
The English then questioned Joan over the course of the next several days, trying to find something that she had done wrong that deserved the death penalty. They couldn't really find anything, except that she dressed up like a man.
Mr. I'll make a man out of you.
Very much like Disney's Mulan. Unfortunately, this didn't have a happy ending like that did. Joan was burned alive at the stake. She asked for a cross before she died, and an English soldier gave her a small wooden cross. Witnesses said she forgave her accusers and asked them to pray for her. She was only 19 years old when she died. Joan of Arc's leadership and sacrifice inspired the French to continue to fight back. Although it took many years, they pushed the English army out of France, taking Bordeaux in 1453, signalling the end of the 100-Year War. By the 1500s, with the 100-Year War behind them, France started to rebuild. There was also peace and development for the country, with new ideas and exploration at hand. This included French explorer Samuel de Champlain, who founded Quebec City in the whole new world. But soon, people did want to close their eyes and hold their breath, as by the early 1600s, the 30-Year War broke out. Initially, it was a war between Protestant and Catholic states in a falling Holy Roman Empire, but soon it gradually developed into a more general conflict involving most of the great powers of Europe. Before this war ended, monarchies, or royal families, now ruled France and had so for many years. The royals were taxing the people so that the royal families and nobles were very rich, and most of the French people lived in poverty.
Help me, I'm poor.
Now, King Louis is a name that you might have heard many times before, and the reason for this is that there were so many King Louis in European history. These kings were all part of the French royal family, known as the House of Bourbon. The most famous King Louis being King Louis XIV, XV, and XVI.
Bonjour, my name is King Louis XIV, and I was the King of France. I was the longest ruling King Louis that existed through our reign. I was also known as the Sun King due to my long reign and many accomplishments which I achieved during my time. Others say it is because of the emblem that I chose, which was my face in the middle of the sun. This is how I got my nickname, the Sun King. During my reign, I had the Versailles built in 1682. This would be the royal palace, which future kings would then later rule in. During my reign, it was a time that I managed to build up my fortune that future rulers would come to enjoy. After my death, after 72 years of being in charge, King Louis XV was next in line. The only problem was he was 5 years old. So he had help from people who helped me to be king, until he would become of age. With both his parents dead and his great-grandfather passing, which was myself, he was next in line to the throne. The only problem was that King Louis XV was a bit of a partier.
I love being the King of France. The reason for this is I get to have so many parties with all the people that I love. But there are people here at the party who are talking behind my back, saying that I am responsible for the damaging between the foreign relations, and also that I am putting the country in financial crisis. But how could I? I have these elaborate parties that are so amazing that people do love to come and have a look at. I've also heard them talking about that when I die, I will die a hated man. But that is fine. I can enjoy the riches while I have them. I like to spend all the money that King Louis XIV had set up for all the future kings. Now, if you excuse me, I must get back to my party. Guards, there's a girl here that was not invited.
She doesn't even go here.
During King Louis XV's reign, of course, another war broke out. History just likes to keep repeating itself over and over again. This time it was a global conflict, known in the Americas as the French and Indian War. And officially, it began many years before, when England declared war on France. However, the fighting and skirmishes between England and France have been going on in North America for many years. The reason for this is that these kingdoms owned land which were overseas. This war, however, affected Europe, including Prussia, which is modern-day Czech Republic, also North America, Central America, West Africa, India, and even the Philippines. Eventually, this war would end with the signing of peace agreements in February 1763, and many countries gave up a lot of their territories located overseas. King Louis XV did continue to rule, but passed away due to tuberculosis. This then led the way for the new French ruler, King Louis XVI, who became king in 1774. Now he would marry Marie Antoinette, an Austrian princess from the Habsburg family. This family is a bit weird, a little bit Game of Thrones style. They were inbred and they liked incest quite a lot. She was only 14 years old when she married the future king, King Louis XVI, who was only 15 years old. After the death of King Louis XV's son, King Louis XVI was next in line and needed to be married. It took 7 years for King Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette to consummate their marriage, basically getting it on. The couple lived in the Palace of Versailles, located in the outskirts of Paris. Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette's reign was hard on the people of France. They were supporting American revolutionaries to get America as an ally. The royals taxed the Parisians 90% of the working wage to support aid in America and to build a wealthy life as their fortune was small. The saying goes that Louis XIV built the fortune, Louis XV spent the fortune, and Louis XVI got all the repercussions. So in order for the royals to get back on track living the high life, taxing the people was the way to go. Obviously, the people were devastated, barely getting by week to week on the small wages left over. But no one could say anything. If people spoke ill about the royals, they were sent to Bastille. Now Bastille was an old fortress built for the 100-Year War, which was later converted into and used as a state prison by the royals. Soon, the people had had enough. Wild parties were being thrown by the royals at the expenses of the people. Rebel groups formed and banded together to come up with a plan to attack the royals, starting with storming the Bastille prison. On July 14, 1789, a rebel group stormed the Invalides building located in the city of Paris. The Invalides building was where the city's weapons were stored. They stole what they could, as well as finding and making their own makeshift weapons. Once they were ready, they headed for the prison. The streets were full of people, marching towards the prison grounds, angry and ready to fight. The prison guards saw the mob approaching, and before any weapons were used, the guards at Bastille surrendered. The mob then stormed inside, ready to free the hundreds of people that were in there. Or so they thought. When they went inside, they rescued 7 prisoners. The only prisoners that were locked up. One of the men was insane and believed he was Julius Caesar, King Louis himself, and even Jesus. Another man refused to leave until he finished his roast prison dinner. It was then decided to demolish the prison, brick by brick. This day would go down in history as Bastille Day and the beginning of the French Revolution. The people soon had their taxes lowered, and the start of the National Assembly, where the people could practice free speech, was established. However, it only lasted 1 month, as taxes were soon hiked up and the people suffered poverty yet again. The people couldn't stand it, and next was the Women's March to Versailles. This march began among the women at the marketplace of Paris, who on the morning of the 5th of October 1789 were near rioting over the high price and short supply of bread. Their demonstrations quickly became intertwined with the activities of revolutionary groups. The market women and their various allies grew into a mob of thousands, and were encouraged by revolutionary agitators. They ransacked the city armory for weapons, being the Invalid building yet again, and marched to the Palace of Versailles. In a dramatic and violent confrontation, they successfully pressed their demands upon King Louis XVI. The next day, the crowd compelled King Louis, his family, and most of the French assembly to return with them to Paris. The royal family moved into the Louvre, which Marie Antoinette said was too small. But as the royals settled into their new residence, France enjoyed more of a democracy-style government, but for some, it wasn't enough. Plans to execute the royals were coming into action by revolutionary groups. Maximilien Robespierre was the leader for the Committee of Public Safety known as the Jacobins, believed to be one of the mobs behind the storming of Bastille. He spoke out against removing the royals from power by execution. The royals had somehow heard about this and hired 700 Swiss guards from the neutral country of Switzerland to protect them. They surrounded the Louvre and the Tuileries Gardens adjacent from the building. The royal couple became nervous and planned to seek refuge in Austria, staying with Marie Antoinette's family, the Habsburgs. As time went by, surprise surprise, more wars were breaking out within Europe, which the French backed by order of the king. Soon, revolutionary groups found out about the plan for the royals to flee to Austria, making them mad and come up with plans to stop them from leaving. On August 10, 1792, a huge mob approached the Tuileries Garden gates, bearing weapons and ready to fight. A huge battle broke out against the Swiss guards. King Louis and Marie Antoinette tried to escape but were captured. All 700 Swiss guards were killed, and the royals were sent to the Conciergerie, which was a prison located on the banks of the Seine River. This would bring the beginning of the fall of the French monarchy and the start of the French Revolutionary Wars, which were a series of sweeping military conflicts throughout Europe. King Louis XVI was then trialed for high treason and was sentenced to death. The decision was to be death by the guillotine, which would only mean one thing. And just like that, King Louis was executed. Following the king's execution, the French Revolution threw itself into its most violent and turbulent phase. In June 1793, the Jacobins, led by Maximilien Robespierre, seized control and instituted a series of radical measures, including the establishment of a new calendar and the destruction of Christianity. They also unleashed the bloody Reign of Terror. This horror movie-like title was a game changer in the French Revolution. A 10-month period in which suspected enemies of the revolution were guillotined by the thousands. 9 months after King Louis XVI was executed, Marie Antoinette met the same fate in the same way. Many of the killings were carried out under the orders from Maximilien Robespierre, who dominated the public safety. Eventually, the people would rebel against Robespierre, and he suffered his own execution on July 28, 1974. The death toll ranged in the tens of thousands, with 16,500 executed by guillotine and another 25,000 in other executions across France. This would bring the end of the Reign of Terror. With the French royal family gone, the people took control of the country, but they were at a little bit of a loss, as they really didn't know what to do with it. They needed someone to come into power, so they started looking around. Then they thought of a man, a small man, a powerful man. I've got it. How about a yellow minion? Unfortunately, no. They couldn't get King Bob. But he would be small and powerful, and his name is Napoleon Bonaparte. To me, Napoleon was kind of like Lord Farquaad from Shrek.
Evening.
Although him coming into power didn't happen right away, it eventually did. While the French Revolution was happening, Napoleon was in the battlefield on the island of Corsica in the south of France. Upon Napoleon's return, he allied himself with the radical group, the Jacobins.
Indeed.
He then received a position as the artillery commander in 1793, as Napoleon came up with a strategy that helped to defeat the British and force them out of battle at the siege of Toulon. His military leadership in this battle was recognised by the current people in government of France.
Go on.
And at the bright young age of 24, he was promoted to the position of general. In 1796, Napoleon was given command of the French army in Italy to help fight the Austrians. When he arrived in Italy, he found the army to be poorly organised and losing the battle. Napoleon, however, was ambitious and also a brilliant general. He used superior organisation in order to move troops rapidly around the battlefield so that they would always outnumber the enemy. He soon drove the Austrians out of Italy and became a national hero. If Napoleon had a theme song back in its time, it probably would have been this. It seemed like he'd been everywhere. After leading a military exhibition in Egypt,
Walk like an Egyptian.
Napoleon returned to Paris in 1799. The political climate in France was changing. The current government, called the Directory, was losing power. Together with his allies, also his brother, Napoleon found a new government called the Consulate. Initially, there were to be 3 consuls at the head of the government, but Napoleon gave himself the first title of consul. This basically meant that he became the dictator of France. As the dictator of France, Napoleon was able to institute a number of government reforms. One of these reforms was the famous Napoleonic Code. This code said that the government positions would not be appointed based on a person's birth or religion, but on their qualifications and abilities. This was a big change in the French government. Before the Napoleonic Code, high positions were given to aristocrats by the kings in return for favours. This often led to incompetent people in important positions. Not only that, but Napoleon also helped to improve the French economy by building new roads and encouraging businesses. He re-established the Catholic Church as the official state religion, but at the same time allowed for freedom of religion to those who weren't Catholic. He also established non-religious schools, so anyone could get an education. Finally, the Revolutionary Wars ended in 1802, but with Napoleon in power, the Napoleonic Wars broke out in 1803, and by 1804 he was crowned the first emperor of France. Now Napoleon was excited for Coronation Day.
It's Coronation Day!
However, he must have left his manners at home, as he did not allow the Pope to place the crown on his head.
Who cares?
He grabbed the crown from the Pope and placed it on his head. This tiny little man's power was all going to his head. Soon, France was at war with Britain, surprise surprise, Austria and Russia. After losing a naval battle against Britain at the Battle of Trafalgar, he boosted his ego and decided to attack Austria. He soundly defeated the Austrian and Russian armies at the Battle of Austerlitz in 1805, and over the next several years expanded the French Empire. At its greatest extent in 1811, France controlled much of Europe, from Spain to the borders of Russia, but did not include Britain.
You sound like you're from London!
But soon, all that would change in 1812, when Napoleon made his first major mistake.
Did you say stay?
He decided to invade Russia. Napoleon marched a huge army of around 500,000 to Russia.
Some of you may die, but it's a sacrifice I am willing to make.
Many of them starved to death along the way, and after a fierce battle with the Russian army, the Russian troops stormed ahead of the French and started to evacuate and burn villages, as Napoleon was relying on these places to resupply and continue battle. Napoleon kept fighting his men through, knowing that soon enough they would be in Moscow. But when they entered, they found the city deserted and on fire, with many of the supplies gone. As the cold, bitter Russian winter approached, Napoleon's army ran out of supplies. He had no choice but to return to France, marching his now 100,000 men back across the country. By the time he returned to French soil, most of what was left of his army had died from the weather or starved to death. With much of Napoleon's army decimated from the invasion in Russia, the rest of Europe now turned on France. Despite winning a few victories, Napoleon had too small of an army and soon was forced from power, being replaced by Louis XVIII and his government, as Louis XVII died in prison years prior. Napoleon was then exiled from France and and sent to the island of Elba off of Italy in 1814. However, Napoleon escaped from Elba in 1815. He returned to the French soil, and the French army, who still respected Napoleon, quickly backed him in what would become known as the takeover of Paris for a period called the 100 Days. This is where he became ruler once again. However, the rest of Europe wouldn't stand for it. They gathered their armies and met him at Waterloo. That's right guys, just like the ABBA song. Waterloo, which is in present-day Belgium, was at the time controlled by the United Kingdom. 1815 saw Napoleon once again forced into exile. He lost the battle at Waterloo and was sent to the island of St. Helena. He named his son Napoleon II the new emperor. However, this only lasted for 2 days, as the decision was overthrown and a new treaty was signed in Paris, allowing the power to return to Louis XVIII and the House of Bourbon. Napoleon died 6 years after being exiled to St. Helena, which is located 4,000 kilometers from Rio in Brazil. It is likely that he died from stomach cancer. Many paintings of Napoleon today show him holding his stomach. It is likely that he died from stomach cancer. It is believed his niece poisoned him with arsenic at a younger age, giving him lifelong crippling pains. He always wanted to be buried close to the River Seine in Paris. In the years to follow, Louis XVIII would rule until his health declined and he died in 1824, with his brother Charles X taking over until the July Revolution. This was a revolutionary war to remove the House of Bourbon descendants and replace it with the House of Orleans, which were pretty much just descendants from the House of Bourbon, such as brothers, distant cousins, nephews or uncles of the King Louis, and just ruled different territories. King Louis Philippe was next in line from the House of Orleans and began negotiation plans to recover Napoleon's body from St. Helena and have it placed in a tomb close to the River Seine. King Louis Philippe respected Napoleon as a great leader and also military soldier and wanted to respect his burial wishes. King Louis Philippe I was overthrown from his power during the February Revolution of 1848. In that same year, Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, also known as Napoleon III, was the nephew of the original Napoleon. He won the first direct presidential elections ever held in France with an overwhelming 74.2% of the votes cast. He was elected largely because of his famous name, but also because of his promises to try and end poverty and improve the lives of the everyday people in France. Napoleon III hired Baron von Haussmann, a well-respected man who had great plans to redesign the poverty-stricken and poorly designed Paris. He had ideas of cleaning up the city, removing the middle-aged structures, placing parklands, redesigning roads, adding boulevards, and making Paris a beautiful city. Between those years, Napoleon would be captured and his empire would fall during the Franco-Prussian War, and a new government was established. With a lot of changes happening in Paris, the city itself soon had a huge art boom with a technique called Impressionism. Impressionism began in France when a group of young and talented artists decided to rebel against the established art critics. They called and formed a new style of painting of their own. Impressionists wanted to capture a moment in time. Critics said that a work was merely impressions of reality, and this is how the name stuck. The Impressionist movement began in the 1860s and became most popular in the 1870s and 1880s. Claude Monet, a famous Parisian artist, became friends with several of the leading artists of its time. Together, they formed the Society of Anonymous Painters, Sculptors and Printers. They wanted to experiment with different techniques and not do the same classical style that satisfied the art critics of Paris. They organised an exhibition in 1874, and one critic called it the Exhibition of Impressionists. The term impressionist was used to imply that the art was just an impression of something and not completed. It was meant to be an insult. But despite the critics of Impressionism, Monet continued to refine his work. He continued to try and capture the changing effects of colour with light. He used a wide range of vibrant colours and painted quickly using short brush strokes. Soon, Monet's work began to get recognition. His paintings started to sell. He even organised an Impressionist art exhibition in the United States in 1886. Towards the end of his life, Monet embarked on his largest project. It involved a number of huge paintings of a pond in different lighting and conditions, such as morning, sunset, and with clouds. When finished, all the panels together were over 6 feet tall and nearly 300 feet long. This would become the famous Water Lilies painting. At the prime of his career, Monet was considered the greatest artist in France, and he is still considered one of the great French artists of all time. By 1887, the construction of one of the world's most famous landmarks would begin, the beginning of the Eiffel Tower. Not only this, but also construction of many other buildings began as well. It was to be ready for a fair to celebrate the 100 years since the storming of Bastille and the start of the French Revolution. This would be known as the World's Fair, showcasing the beauty of Paris, which would last from the 6th of May to the 31st of October, 1889. Construction had to begin early for it all to be ready on time. This then paved the way for people to fall in love with Paris and return in the summer of the year 1900 for the Summer Olympics. A committee was formed to organise the games, and they sat down to organise which sports would be included. The sports to be included were things like track and field athletics, swimming, wrestling, gymnastics, fencing, French and British boxing, river and ocean yacht racing, cycling, golf, lifesaving, archery, weightlifting, rowing, diving, and water polo. Oh, Jesus. But there were some unusual events that were contested for the only time in the history of the games, including things like automobile and motorcycle racing, ballooning, cricket, a 200-metre swimming obstacle race and underwater swimming, and also this was the only Olympic Games in history to use live animals such as pigeons as targets during the shooting event. It was a very successful Olympic Games. In the years to follow, the nations of Europe were constantly trying to get power and were also making secret alliances. Germany made an alliance with the Austrian-Hungary Empire as well as Italy, and these countries all agreed to protect each other in the event if they were ever attacked by France. However, Italy then went and made a secret alliance with France, saying they would not aid Germany. In response to Germany's alliances, France and Russia then established their own alliance. The triple entity was formed between France, Britain and Russia in 1907. Germany felt that this powerful alliance surrounding them posed a real threat to their existence and the power in the region. Some European countries, such as France and Britain, had created large worldwide empires and had become very rich. Other European countries, such as Russia and Germany, wanted to create their own vast empires. This caused competition and conflict between many of the countries throughout the world. In 1914, the situation in Europe was tense. Secret alliances, internal politics, and a desire to grow empires had built up distrust and dislike between many of the European powers. All it would take was one international event and Europe would be at war. On June 28, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the throne of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, was assassinated in Sarajevo. The Austrian government believed that the assassination was organised by the Serbian government. They also saw this as an opportunity to gain control of Serbia. The Austrian-Hungarian Empire issued a number of harsh demands on Serbia, threatening to invade them if they did not comply. They gave them 48 hours to respond. When Serbia's response fell short of the demands, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia on July 28, 1914. Austria-Hungary had hoped that they could quickly take over Serbia and that Serbia allies Russia would not risk a major war in order to help Serbia. However, they figured wrong. Russia immediately began to mobilize its troops and prepare for war. In response, Germany, Austria-Hungary's close ally, declared war on Russia on August 1st. A few days later, Germany declared war on France and invaded Belgium. Britain then declared war on Germany, all of this happening within a few days. World War I had begun. A lot of World War I was fought using trench warfare along the Western Front. The armies hardly moved at all, they just bombed and shot at each other from across the trenches. Some of the major battles during the war included the First Battle of Marne, Battle of Tannenberg, Battle of Gallipoli, the Battle of Verdun, and the Battle of Somme. The Battle of Somme was one of the largest battles that occurred during World War I. It took place near the Somme River in France and lasted from July 1st to November 18 in 1916. The battle was fought between the Allies, the British and the French on one side, and the German Empire on the other. Many of the British soldiers saw their first fighting at the Battle of Somme. They were part of a volunteer army called the Kitchener's Army because they were recruited by Lord Kitchener. For nearly 2 years since the Battle of Marne, the two sides had been engaged in trench warfare along the Western Front. The British and the French were planning a massive offensive attack at Somme in hopes of pushing the Germans out of France. However, their plans were changed when the Germans went on the offense and attacked the French at the Battle of Verdun. French troops were sent to Verdun to hold off the Germans. The French also demanded that the British push up and attack at Somme from August 1st to July 1st in hopes that the German forces would be diverted from Verdun to Somme. Before the actual attack, the Allies began by bombarding the German lines. They believed that this bombardment would destroy the front lines of the German trenches, allowing the soldiers to walk in and take over. They bombarded the Germans constantly for 8 straight days with 3,000 guns. They fired over 1,600,000 shells. However, the Germans were warned of the bombardment. They took shelter and they waited. Little real damage was done to the German fortifications, and many of the British shells were duds and never even exploded. The Allied commanders refused to take warning that the bombardment didn't work. After the 8 days, they ordered the attack. Thousands of British soldiers got out of their trenches and began to advance on the German lines. They were easily gunned down by the Germans. It was the worst day in history of British warfare. They suffered around 60,000 casualties, including 20,000 dead on the first day of battle. This happened on July 1st, 1916. Despite the heavy casualties, the Allies continued to attack. They didn't let up on the attack until November 18th. During that time, they gained ground, around about 7 miles of territory, but suffered around 623,000 casualties, including 423,000 British and 200,000 French. The Germans had around 500,000 casualties. With over 1 million total casualties on each side, the Battle of Somme was one of the bloodiest battles in human history. In August of 1918, the Allied commanders on the Western Front decided to go on the offensive. Starting on August 8th, a series of battles were fought called the 100 Days Offensive. Eventually, the Germans were pushed out of France and forced to retreat back into Germany. By the end of the 100 Days Offensive, the German forces were exhausted and running out of food and supplies. On November 11, 1918, they requested an armistice. An armistice is when both sides agree to stop fighting while peace treaty is negotiated. The Allies agreed to the armistice, and at 11 AM on November 11, 1918, the fighting in World War I came to an end. The Allied nations met in Paris at the Paris Peace Conference in 1919 to decide the fate of Germany and the Central Powers. Although a number of nations took part in the negotiations, the major decisions and discussions were between the leaders of the Big Four nations, which included the Prime Minister of France, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, the President of the United States, and the Prime Minister of Italy. Each of the 4 nations had different opinions on how Germany should be treated. The US President thought that Germany should not be blamed for the war or punished too harshly. However, the French Prime Minister felt that Germany was responsible for the war and should take the blame and be forced to pay large reparations. The Treaty of Versailles was signed between the Allied powers and Germany on June 28, 1919. This officially ended World War I. The treaty was extremely harsh on Germany. It forced Germany to accept the responsibility for causing all the loss and damage of the war. Germany was forced to disarm, give up land to France, and pay the reparations of 132 billion marks, which works out to be around about $450 billion. The map of Europe then changed significantly after World War I. Several new independent countries were formed, including Poland, Finland, Yugoslavia, and Czechoslovakia. Russia became the Soviet Union, and the Ottoman Empire later became the country of Turkey. As part of the Paris Peace Conference, an organization called the League of Nations was formed. The League of Nations was formed in an effort to establish world peace. Its member countries hoped to prevent wars by helping to settle disputes between the countries. The League also aimed to establish fair labour conditions, improve global health, control the global arms trade, and protect minorities in Europe. The League was officially founded by the Treaty of Versailles and had 42 founding member countries. With the economic turmoil left behind by World War I, some countries were taken over by dictators who formed powerful fascist governments. The first fascist government would be Spain, which was ruled by the dictator Franco. Then Mussolini took control of Italy. These dictators wanted to expand their empires and began to look for new land to conquer. Italy invaded and took over Ethiopia in 1935, and Adolf Hitler would follow in Mussolini's footsteps by trying to take over Germany. The nations of Europe were on edge, and they did not want another war. When countries such as Italy and Germany became aggressive and began to take over their neighbours and built up their armies, countries such as Britain and France hoped to keep the peace through appeasement. This meant that they tried to make Germany as well as Adolf Hitler happy rather than trying to stop him. They hoped that by meeting his demands he would be satisfied and there wouldn't be any war. Unfortunately, the policy of appeasement backfired. It only made Hitler bolder. It also gave him time to build up his army. Soon, there was a time of the great economic suffering through the world called the Great Depression. After the US market crash of 1929, many people throughout the world were out of work and struggling to survive. This created unstable governments and worldwide turmoil that helped lead to World War II. World War II was fought between the axes of power, which included Germany, Italy, and Japan, and also the Allied powers, which included Britain, the United States, the Soviet Union, and also France. The war began when Germany invaded Poland in 1939. In 1940, the Parisians awoke to the sound of a German accent through a loudspeaker, saying that a curfew was being imposed for 8 p.m. That evening, German troops would enter and occupy Paris. By the time the German tanks rolled into Paris, 2 million Parisians had fled, with good reason. In short order, the German Gestapo went to work. Arrests, interrogations, and spying were the order of the day. Soon, a giant swastika flag flew beneath the Arc de Triomphe. While many Parisians were trapped in their capital city, many French men and women in the West cheered as Canadian troops rolled through the region, offering hope for a free France. The war continued. Overseas, Japan attacked the US naval ships by bombing Pearl Harbor. Europe was suffering with the effects of the Holocaust, as well as the axis of power invading different countries. On June 6, 1944, the Allied forces of Britain, America, Canada, and France attacked German forces on the coast of Normandy, located in France. With a huge force of over 150,000 soldiers, the Allies attacked and gained victory that became the turning point of World War II in Europe. This famous battle is sometimes called D-Day, or the invasion of Normandy. Germany had invaded France and was trying to take over all of Europe, including Britain. However, Britain and the United States had managed to slow down the expanding German forces. They were now able to turn on the offensive. To prepare for the invasion, the Allies amassed troops and equipment in Britain. They also increased the number of airstrikes and bombings in German territory. Right before the invasion, over 1,000 bombers a day were hitting German targets. They bombed railroads, bridges, airfields, and other strategic places in order to slow down the hinder of the German army. The Germans knew that the invasion was coming. They could tell by all the forces that were gathering in Britain as well as by the additional airstrikes. What they didn't know was where the Allies would strike next. In order to confuse the Germans, the Allies tried to make it look like they were going to attack north of Normandy at Calais. Although the D-Day invasion had been planned for months, it was almost cancelled due to bad weather. General Eisenhower finally agreed to attack despite the overcast skies. Although the weather did have some effect on the Allies' ability to attack, it also caused the Germans to think that no attack was coming. They were less prepared as a result. The first wave of the attack began with paratroopers. These were men who jumped out of planes using parachutes. They jumped at night in the pitch black and landed behind enemy lines. Their job was to destroy key targets and capture bridges in order for the main invasion force to land on the beach. Thousands of dummies were also dropped in order to draw fire and confuse the enemy. The next stage of battle saw thousands of planes drop bombs on German defences. Soon after, warships began to bomb the beaches from the water. While the bombing was going on, underground, members of the French resistance sabotaged the Germans by cutting telephone lines and destroying railroads. Soon, the main invasion force of over 6,000 ships carrying troops, weapons, tanks and equipment approached the beaches of Normandy. American troops landed at Omaha and Utah beaches. The Utah landing was successful, but the fighting in Omaha beach was fierce. Many US soldiers lost their lives at Omaha, but they were finally able to take the beach. By the end of D-Day, over 150,000 troops had landed in Normandy. They pushed their way inland, allowing more troops to land over the next several days. By June 17th, over 500,000 Allied troops had arrived and began to push the Germans out of France. Germany then counterattacked, and a great battle, called the Battle of the Bulge, was fought. Hundreds of thousands of US troops held the Germans back, and the German army was finally defeated. Many things changed once World War II was over. Much of Europe and Eastern Asia had been destroyed by the fighting and bombings that had taken place over many years. Also, many countries' borders needed to be re-established, especially where Germany or Japan had taken over. Germany had occupied much of Europe during World War II. Many of the countries in the West returned to the same governments and borders they had prior to the war. However, Germany was divided up into the Eastern and Western Germany. The eastern part was controlled by the USSR, which is Russia, and the western part by the Allies. The USSR also took control of many of the countries in Eastern Europe where they had fought in against the Germans. This included Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, Albania, Hungary and Czechoslovakia. Europe was in much need of financial aid due to all the roads, bridges and buildings being destroyed in the fighting. The United States offered aid in the form of the Marshall Plan to help Europe recover. After the war, many leaders from Japan and Germany were brought to trial. They had violated the rules of the war according to the Geneva Convention and had also committed crimes against humanity. These crimes included the Holocaust, slave labour, and the terrible treatment and torture of prisoners of war. Many of these leaders were then executed for their crimes. The Allies then formed the United Nations in order to try and prevent World War III from happening. The United Nations was formed on October 24, 1945. There were 51 original member nations, including the 5 permanent Security Council members. This included China, France, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, and the United States. Europe became divided into the Eastern Bloc of nations and the West. The Eastern Bloc was led by and controlled by the Soviet Union, which is Russia. These countries were run by a communist government and had their own alliance called the Warsaw Pact. The Western countries, including the United States, formed an alliance against communism called NATO. These two alliances, NATO and the Warsaw Pact, would take part in the arms race war called the Cold War. The Cold War never escalated into a full war due to the fear of what would happen to the world if many countries started dropping atomic bombs. However, it did see the rise of the Berlin Wall, the race to see who could get to the moon first, the battle between North and South Korea, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Vietnam War, and also the collapse of the Soviet Union. The Cold War would last for the next 45 years. In 1958, Charles de Gaulle, who was a former French military general, re-entered into politics and was elected the President of France. During World War II, Charles de Gaulle created his own French government after the original government surrendered to Germany. He fled to Britain and set up a new French government known as Free France, which would fight for France's freedom. He oversaw the end of World War II and helped France to form a new government. He then resigned from office, only to return to politics in 1958, and would remain president for the next 10 years. During de Gaulle's time as president, France's economy boomed and the country had fully recovered from World War II. He died a year after resigning from politics from a heart attack, and to many is viewed as a French hero. Throughout the decades, the European countries banded together in order to create a more unified continent with easier travel, trade and communication, and peace. France would be one of the founders of the organisation known as today's European Union. It was founded in the early 90s after the collapse of the Soviet Union. By the early 2000s, new currency would be introduced and replace 12 national currencies, including the French franc. More European countries are wanting to join the EU, but must meet requirements before they can do so. Although the path for peace is paved throughout Europe, on the evening of the 13th of November 2015, a series of coordinated terrorist attacks occurred in Paris. It involved suicide bombings and mass shootings. 138 people lost their lives in the attacks. The world would come to show their support by illuminating the colours of the French flag on monuments from around the globe. The Parisians stated that they would not live in fear or let the terrorists win. Today, France is the largest country within Western Europe and is the leading country within the European Union for food exports. There are a variety of temperatures and weather conditions, including cool and humid in the north, with the southern parts being warm and dry. France is one of my personal favourites. It was one of the first European countries I came to visit. From its beautiful cities to its countryside and beaches, its tasty pastries and cheeses, plus amazing wine. I hope you will love this country as much as I do, and may it open up your world to something new and exciting.